Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Sun at Twilight, Empire at Twilight, Book 4 by N.L. Holmes, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. It was dawn. Tashmi-Sharuma stood with his back to the rocks in the vain hope of blocking the wind and snow from his eyes, which were watering more from sleeplessness than from snow. Before him, the court cut into the bedrock was full of ash, hissing and steaming as the snowflakes danced their way to death in the cooling remnants of the bonfire that had burned all night. The old women had not yet come with their tongs to pick out the calcined bones of his father, wash them with wine, and soak them in oil. Tashmi-Sharuma was alone. No one had dared to stay with him, watching all night as the pyre blazed against the winter darkness. They knew him well enough to know he wanted to keep vigil by himself. Even his mother had discreetly left him to his solitude. His cousin Karunta would have stayed, but Tashmi-Sharuma had sent him away. He needed to cry out to the gods, yet he couldn't find any words. He was now the emperor of all the lands that called Hadi their master. He feared he no longer knew who he was or who he should be. Until 2 days ago, he had been Prince Tashmi-Sharuma, an imperfect, uncomfortable identity he had inhabited for 35 years. But since the day before yesterday, things had changed. The old king had become a god, and Tashmi-Sharuma had been consecrated in his place. He was now Twilight, great king, the fourth of that name. Now he alone shepherded the people of the storm god. He alone bore responsibility for injustices and wrongdoing. From within his fur-lined cloak he drew a deep breath. His new name and his new responsibility perched upon him awkwardly, a little too big, a little too heavy. And within the young king's chest fear hunkered like an unquiet animal. His father had been a great king, but Hadashilu's sins had been many, and now they were Tashmi-Sharuma's own. Suddenly alone was a frightening word, even for a man who valued solitude. Storm god of Hadi, forgive my father's wrongs. Don't bring his guilt down upon my head and the heads of your people. Tashmi-Sharuma murmured, his breath hanging in a cloud before his face until cloud and words dispersed into the air. He watched the snowflakes' manic descent. The ash was still too hot for the snow to begin piling up, but the air was thick with it, veiling the brutal gray wall of rock that rose at his back, softening the gray rock of the buildings across the court. Rock was alive, divine, but not kindly. Tashmi-Sharuma shivered. He stared up into the falling snow. The very air was seething with it. Flakes struck him in the eyes and melted upon his face. The funeral party would be lucky not to be trapped up here in the mountain stone house, mortuary temple of the late king Hattusili, son of Murshili. The rites would go on for a fortnight, and then everyone would return to the capital, if the roads were not impassable, near though the site was to the city walls. Tashmi-Sharuma almost hoped the return would be delayed. He wasn't a coward, he told himself. He had fought on the field of battle since he was 12 years old and had served as the chief of his father's bodyguard from his 18th year. He had been a priest of the storm god of Narek almost since he'd been old enough to read, facing the hostile onslaughts of darkness armored only in the power of ritual words. He had learned to set aside his own preferences and pleasures for the needs of the kingdom, a campaign that took perhaps even more courage. But he couldn't repress the sense of dread that sat like a suffocating weight upon his chest. He was the son of a usurper. He would be punished. Now the black-wrapped old women, the priestesses of Lalwani, queen of the underworld, were approaching, their tongs in hand. Tashmi-Sharuma watched them as they began their duties, scattering the ash, quenching the coals with wine, completing the work the storm god himself had begun. Steam rose in angry clouds from the extinguished ashes, so that the priestesses seemed to be pouring out smoke from their beakers. Their mantles whipped in the wind. Only the rock at his back shielded the young king, but far from keeping him warmer, its presence behind him radiated cold like a piece of bronze left out in the winter. He turned away from the priestesses. Although they were the sole human figures in a world of stone and ice, the women's proximity didn't comfort him. They were like the black ravens that violated the bodies of the dead on the battlefield. Tashmi Sharuma suspected he was almost invisible where he stood, his gray wolf fur cloak one with the gray of the stone. The women didn't seem to see him. Their voices, half blown away on the wind, rose in broken pieces of melody as they chanted. They stooped from time to time, lifting an unburnt fragment of bone with their tongs and dropping it into a bag. This very night the late king's mortal remains would be cushioned in purple wool and laid upon his chair, and he would preside for one last time at the banquet his family shared with him. "That's all that is left of the body that used to be my father's," thought Tashmi Sharuma, an unexpected wave of quiet sorrow filling him. He accepted this. Death was something he had seen plenty of in his not-so-long life. Men dead on the battlefield, struck down because they had dared to oppose their rightful lords. The young king's own firstborn son, dead within weeks of birth, was harder to explain. One minute the living were here, warm and solid and heavy, and then they were gone, and nothing was ever the same again. Tashmi Sharuma thought of his father's laugh and his hand upon his small son's head back when the late king had just been the brother of a king, the uncle of a king. "My father's soul has become a god." Tashmi Sharuma looked up into the snow again as if he might catch a glimpse of the late king's spirit rising through the white air. This was harder to understand. He wondered if Hattusili now saw all the events of his long life with the pitiless clarity of God's sight. Did the light of divine justice make him regret his black deeds? Did his father acknowledge that he should never have seized the kingship, and that it should have been his nephew, Uriteshub, and not Tashmi Sharuma upon the throne? The wan light of the winter sun, invisible behind the clouds, had given up, and the funeral banquet had begun. The bones of Hattusili, wrapped in purple wool, dyed with the priceless blood of the murex shell, tribute of coastal vassals, rested in his accustomed chair at the head of the table. At his side sat the Tawana, Pudhuhepa, the old king's wife of 37 years, still beautiful in her 50s. She was grave, but smiling, gracious as ever, with a fortifying word for every relative present. Her words could slaughter, but tonight she was all comfort and condolence. The guests, for the most part, were the sons and cousins and nephews of the late king. Hattusili's family was fecund. Tashmi Sharuma realized a mixed blessing. The brothers of the deceased were all dead, except for old Nwanza, but their sons were here. Many others were viceroys or minor kings elsewhere in the empire, and couldn't get back through the snows of winter to their ancestral city. Tashmi Sharuma's married sisters weren't here, of course. Their husbands or ambassadors would make calls of condolence in the summer after the weather became milder and the roads more reliable. But his brothers and half-brothers were present in force. Hattusili had taken seriously his duty to populate the diplomatic corps with royal princes. Through lowered lids, Tashmi Sharuma eyed his eldest half-brother, Narakali, as he made his way to his seat. The son of a second-rank wife, Narakali had been their father's heir, the Kanti, before Tashmi Sharuma had turned 25. He was again the designated heir until the new king should produce one of his own. Narakali had substance. The room seemed smaller in his presence. He was big and good-looking, rich of voice, and expansive of gesture. People scooted their chairs aside to make room for him to take his seat. He had the smooth, cynical affability of a diplomat and the self-assurance of a military commander, in which capabilities he had served for nearly 40 years, longer than the new king had lived. Had Tashmi Sharuma not been a first-rank son, the offspring of a queen, it would have been Narakali sitting on the throne that night. Narakali leaned forward and raised his cup to the king. There was always something a little ambiguous about that smile, a wry twitch of the corners that might or might not be mockery. Years of diplomacy had made the older man's expression hard to read, but Tashmi Sharuma realized that he'd better learn how. His brother would be a formidable rival. The face he longed to see, though, was that of his cousin Karunta, beloved companion of his childhood. The king strained his eyes through the dim, flickering light of too few oil lamps to find him, and Karunta looked up from the table. Even from here, Tashmi Sharuma could see the broad smile that lit the man's face. Dearest Karunta, always laughing, mischievous, daring. The king's cousin rose and slipped behind the diners, and a moment later, Tashmi Sharuma felt him lean beside his ear, long black hair hanging alongside his own. Karunta rested his forearms on the new king's shoulders and whispered, "How you doing, Tosh? Feeling all royal?" "Not very," the king managed a strained smile, not looking back at his cousin. To Karunta, Tashmi Sharuma was still Tosh. No one but Karunta had ever called him that, and the king realized that the days of happy familiarity with his cousin might be coming to an end with his new responsibilities. "I haven't slept all night." "Oh, you haven't, eh? Well, regret that you didn't let me keep watch with you last night, don't you? You could have had some fun up there in Uncle's stone house alone together." "My father has just died, you know." Tashmi Sharuma's voice trembled a little despite his best efforts to keep it steady, and tears burned inside his lids. He fought them back. The king of Hottyland didn't cry in public, and the gods knew he wasn't the tearful sort. People accused him of having no emotions. Karunta laid his cheek on his cousin's head, right upon the crimson cap that was the crown of the great king, and Tashmi Sharuma leaned back against him as if he could draw strength from the very touch of Karunta's body. "Your father is a god now, Tosh. The banquet is for rejoicing that we're all alive. So rejoice, will you? You're always too serious." "Thank you for your advice." The king forced a grin. His cousin clapped him affectionately on the shoulder and slid back to his seat. As the consumption of wine and beer and Wally beverage rose, the tenor of the meal became more hilarious. Tashmi Sharuma tried to keep a pleasant expression on his face, but he knew people had seen and judged his red eyes. The words with which his father's funeral ceremony began were still echoing in his mind. "When a great catastrophe befalls Hattusha and the king becomes a god." He was exhausted. Besides, his chin kept sinking to his collarbone. The conversation around him drifted into a meaningless buzz. He picked at his food, but it didn't interest him. He forced himself to sip at the cup of beer someone had just replenished. He knew people would be watching him from now on.